This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. It was built by accident. The site of ransom demands, the target of Nazi saboteurs, and of terrorist bombs. Standard Time was born there, and the civil rights movement nurtured there. It is a poem in stone, a cultural paradigm, which transformed America, and it just celebrated its 100th birthday. It's Grand Central Terminal, and it's celebrated in Sam Roberts' Grand Central, How a Train Station Transformed America. Sam is the urban affairs correspondent for the New York Times. He's been with the Times since 1983, where he served as a city affairs columnist and deputy editor of the Week in Review. Prior to the Times, Sam worked 15 years at the Daily News. He's won multiple journalism awards and has authored 8 other books. He's the host of the New York Times Up Close on New York One. Sam, welcome.
Thank you, Doug.
Great read, great illustrations. It's really a work of art, and you're all over the place.
Well, I'll tell you, this is one book that was a lot of fun to work on.
You had a great time.
And it's one of those things where you're from New York, you grew up in New York, you think you know everything there is to know about Grand Central, and I just learned so much in researching the book.
I mean, I read this, and I had so many aha moments myself. What were some of the aha moments, you know, that just struck you as, wow?
Well, in addition to the secrets of Grand Central, which I go into in the book,
back of the book, which is great.
I mean, one thing I have to admit, we landed on the title, Grand Central, How a Train Station Transformed
I want to talk
America.
about the subtitle.
And I said, am I going to be able to live up to that? I mean, that's pretty, you know, cosmic.
It is.
And in fact, the more I looked into Grand Central, the more I discovered it had a transformative effect, not just on Manhattan, not just on New York City, but on the whole country.
Yeah, and I read the bit and I said, oh, come on, a train station transformed America. But after reading the book, I said, man, Sam's got a point. Talk about this transformative effect.
Well, you look at it as a cultural icon, and there is no other place in the world like it. If you go anywhere in the world and say, this place is just like Grand Central Station, everybody knows what you're talking about. You don't have to explain any further that you mean frenzy and chaos and bustle. That's what it's all about. You look at movies from North by Northwest. Madagascar, the cartoon feature, Mad Men on television, and it is...
And it goes on and on and on. In fact, as I told you off the set, the first thing I did when I started reading the book is went back to North by Northwest.
Another good excuse to watch the movie.
Right, and a good excuse to read what you wrote, the books you wrote about as well. I mean, give me aha.
Well, why are there so many bare light bulbs in Grand Central Terminal? You'd think they could afford more elaborate fixtures, you know, with crystal globes on them.
But it's beautiful.
It is beautiful, and the reason was the Vanderbilts, when they built the terminal, were showing off. They said, this is an all-electric terminal, probably the first. Not only are the trains electric, so we don't have to worry about the smoke and the cinders and the steam, which block the view of engineers and certainly discomfited passengers, but everything in this terminal is electric, so they were literally showing off the light bulbs.
And there must be thousands of them. I mean, I go through there almost daily, and the bare light bulbs with the shining marble, it's just gorgeous.
It is a beautiful place. It's a majestic place, and what's so interesting about it, and again, I realized this while writing the book, is here was something that was built by private enterprise, in part to show off, in part as a gift to the city of New York. It was rebuilt by public investment, by Metro North, by the MTA, that could have let it really go to seed as it was under the Penn Central Railroad. They brought it back.
Okay, favorite story and anecdote?
Well, my favorite story is about me, I hate to say.
Well, come on.
I was a little kid. I must have been 5, 6, 7. My father used to take me all over the city growing up in Brooklyn. And I remember standing on the platform at Grand Central Terminal one day and looking up at this gleaming locomotive. I even remember the number. It was New York Central 371. Ooh. And I'm staring at it, and the engineer leans out the window and says, "Hey, you want to drive this thing?" And I was, stunned.
Come on, you're in heaven.
He lifted me up, put me on his lap, put my hand on the throttle. It seemed like we had gone a mile, maybe we went a foot. But
you went.
I fell in love with Grand Central from then on.
I know, it really is fabulous. Having researched this book, and it's really an achievement of scholarship, as well as it's so aesthetically pleasing. It's such a beautiful
Well, Grand Central
book.
Publishing did a beautiful job on the photos.
photographs.
And Frank English, the photographer, was just terrific.
It's really excellent. What's one event in the book that you'd like to witness, or characters that you'd like to meet? There are so many characters in this book. I mean, real characters.
There are really characters, and that's one of the things. It's sort of a biography of the building. It's not about stone and mortar. It's about the people who made it. One I would have loved to know was William Wilgus, who was the chief engineer for the New York
Fabulous
Central. Here's a guy
character.
who wakes up one morning and says, "We can't bring coal-burning steam locomotives into Manhattan anymore. It's too dangerous. We've got to electrify. By electrifying, we can get a two-deck terminal, upper and lower level, and we can close over Park Avenue." People forget Park Avenue, almost from Lexington to Madison, all the way up to 57th Street, were open train yards.
It's unbelievable.
In the middle of Manhattan.
Right.
And he said we can deck this over, and created the whole notion of air rights and billions of dollars of real estate.
And again, it's almost deja vu all over again. You've got this Midtown East rezoning.
Right.
Again, the building created this development around it, and it was meant to in part. But the way they did it with the decking and then the air rights, doesn't it sound awful familiar to what's going on now?
It does indeed, and it sounds also familiar to what's going on the West Side. One of the things I learned from the book, and I wondered what the answer was why Penn Station, for all its glory, never had the same kind of urban development impact
at
on
all.
the West
A couple
Side.
of hotels.
I mean, now we are finally getting Hudson Yards, where they're going to deck over the tracks. But
Sure.
why that didn't happen 100 years ago, and in Grand Central it did. In part, the New York Central owned the real estate. That was a big plus. They were able to deck over the yards because of electrification, and they built a real estate empire as well as a railroad.
Wow. One of the interesting things was we have memories, some of them real, about Penn Station and Grand Central. And both stations sort of went through the same thing. We remember Penn Station as this glorious work, but at the end, it was really pretty dowdy. And Grand Central, during the 70s and 80s, before it was renovated in the 90s, was really pretty dowdy. It was seedy, it was sort of
They were both
dirty.
very derelict, no question about it. They were let to go to seed by the Penn Central Railroad, which was either in bankruptcy then or bordered on bankruptcy. They didn't want to maintain it. They didn't know what to do with it. They wanted to build a giant skyscraper over it, which would have certainly affected the historic parts of the terminal. And they said that's what they needed to do to make money. And it was interesting. It was like, a case of parricide, where a kid murders his parents and asks for mercy because he's an orphan.
Right.
They said Grand Central doesn't really matter that much because, look, we already built the Pan Am, now MetLife building there, so nobody cares about it anymore. Well, of course, that was an intrusion enough, and now that we're just saying we can make another intrusion.
Ugly building.
Yes.
I mean, MetLife.
Massive, ugly.
I mean, it's really ugly. You look up the avenue and you see beautiful Penn Station, Grand Central, and then you see that ugly building behind. Talk about one of the interesting events that you chronicle here was in 1975. Very famous person involved in the saving of Grand Central.
Well, again, I thought I knew everything there was to know, but in researching it, I found two fascinating things. That person, of course, was Jackie Onassis. I did not realize that the city had all but decided not to appeal the decision which threw out the landmarks law. They said, we're in the middle of a fiscal crisis.
It's the Beam administration.
We're going to be held liable for damages by the Penn Central Railroad. We just can't afford it. And it was the momentum, it was the mobilization by Jackie Onassis, by Philip Johnson, by Fred Papert, by Ed Koch, who were able to say, this is a giant civil landmark. We don't want Penn Station to have died in vain, in effect. We're going to make sure this thing gets saved. And it was that pressure that really compelled the city to appeal, and a successful appeal.
And they were going to put a 60-story monster on top of
a
the
monstrosity on top of it, which would have affected the facade and to some extent the main concourse as well, and really would have ruined Grand Central. It would have made money for the railroad, but it would have ruined Grand Central.
Okay, now you begin the book by saying that it was started by accident. How? And it's rather peculiar how it started by accident.
Well, it is peculiar. I mean, first, there were stations at that site since 1871. Mm-hmm. That was Grand Central Station, as opposed to Grand Central Terminal, Grand Central Depot. But in 1902, there was an accident. A train coming out of the Park Avenue Tunnel from New Rochelle couldn't see where he was going.
Because of the
snowing,
smoke.
It was smoky, it was foggy, and smacks into another train and kills about 24 people. And the railroad was seriously afraid of being held criminally liable for this and subsequent accidents. So Wilgus, again, the chief engineer, said, there's only one solution to this, it's electrification. We're going to have to tear down the existing station, rip up the tracks that are there, keep functioning as a railroad while that is all going on. And that's why it took 10 years to build Grand Central.
Pretty miraculous that you could literally, I mean, looking at it as a contemporary, shut down all of that traffic, train traffic, and also mind-blowing that it went to 57th Street, open.
Right, it was all the way open there. There were bridges that went across it at some of the crosstown streets, but it was a barricade, if you will, in the middle of Manhattan. People, if you wanted to get from the east side to Fifth Avenue, had to walk all the way up and down avenues.
But that area at that time is still relatively undeveloped.
Well, you know what's so funny? When you look at the main concourse of Grand Central, you see the two matching staircases.
Yeah.
Except that the one on the east was not installed originally. It was in the plans, but they said, why should we put this staircase here? Who is going to go out to the east side of Manhattan? All there are tenements and goat pastures. So they left it out, and it was only put in the 1990s when the terminal was restored.
That's right, and they replaced the Kodak sign.
Yes, indeed. I mean, some great public-spirited decisions by Peter Stengel, by others from Metro-North, who said, this place is a cathedral. We're not going to make it into an indoor version of Times Square.
And in fact, that renovation is probably one of the most successful renovations of a private/public space that I certainly can think of.
It was enlightened self-interest. They wanted to make it a destination. They wanted to make it a
far
fairly
more than a train
expensive
terminal,
retail outlet. There were no more long-distance trains coming in, so they wanted to serve commuters. And now, what's so interesting about it is when the terminal was opened in 1913, the New York Times said someday this place may be able to serve 100 million people. We are now finally approaching that 100 million a year.
Now, how were you approached to write the book?
Well, my agent, who is a terrific guy, Andrew Blauner, said, why don't you write a book on Grand Central? I wish I had thought of it. He did. And he said the centennial is coming up in 2013. They're going to celebrate it. A good reason, if you need one, to write a book about Grand Central. And I started off saying, well, you know, doesn't everyone know everything there is to know? And I learned so much in the course of the book, and I learned so much about how transformative it is culturally, architecturally, in terms of urban planning, in terms of New York, that I just rekindled my love affair with Grand Central.
Wax poetic about all of those elements that you just
Well, you know what I love?
about.
People say, well, what's your favorite spot? I'd say there are two of them. One is the Whispering Gallery, right outside the Oyster Bar. I have to admit, I thought this was one of those urban legends, but it is true. You stand in one corner and whisper into the wall, and your voice goes across this parabolic curve, maybe 40 feet to the other side, and you could hear. This is the interlocking tile Gustavino ceiling. No one knows whether he designed it with that purpose in mind or who discovered it, but it really does work.
It does work. It's like the Capitol in St. Paul's Cathedral. You
Right.
you can really hear it.
That's true.
What else?
Doug, the thing I really love most is standing on the balcony overlooking the concourse and watching this
people.
urban ballet, this choreographed chaos, if you will. And I have to admit, with all these people and something like 750,000 people pass through Grand Central on any given weekday, I've never seen people bump into each other. It's like, you know, bats flying with sonar or something.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Even the tourists with their cameras don't crash into you. It's really a ballet. I imagine if you slowed it down or speed it up, I'm sure somebody's done it dozens of times, you really do have this real ballet.
It's terrific. It's fascinating to watch.
Talk about secrets and myths.
Well, there are lots of myths. Some of them I was having a tough time either proving or disproving.
Yeah, talk about FDR's car.
Well, there is a train siding under the Waldorf Astoria. There's no question it was used by FDR on at least one occasion, totally documented, in part for security, in part to avoid congestion, in part to obscure the fact that he was suffering from polio. There's an elevator that goes right up into the Waldorf. There is a boxcar there that may or may not be the boxcar that was used to carry Roosevelt's automobile. Very hard to, you know, disprove or to prove. But one thing I discovered in doing the book that I found fascinating, when the President of the United States is in town now and stays at the Waldorf, there is a fully equipped, functioning, turned on railroad train ready under the Waldorf to whisk him out of town as an emergency means of egress if need be.
Interesting. What else? Come on.
Well, you look at all the decorative motifs and you see acorns all over the place. And, you know, as I said to someone, am I becoming squirrely or what? I'm seeing acorns.
Uh-oh.
Sorry.
That was bad.
That was bad.
But go ahead.
But in the book, nonetheless. And it turns out that acorns are on the family crest of the Vanderbilts, from, you know, little acorns, mighty oaks like the Vanderbilts grow.
Well, the Romans
and they're all over the
stored
place.
acorns
The departure boards, every one of them are wrong.
I didn't know that. That was very interesting. How are they wrong?
Well, when it says the 144 is leaving for Larchmont, it really leaves at 145. You've got an extra minute. Now, if you miss your train, don't blame me. But in fact, you've got an extra minute that they allow for people to race onto the platform.
Come on. They know commuters.
No, the sky, the ceiling.
Oh, yeah, this is
25,000 square foot celestial ceiling, which is absolutely stunning. Just beautiful. In fact, there's a little rectangle you can see of before and after, before they cleaned it, and it's all smudgy and dirty.
You're right.
And they thought this was the smoke from the locomotives. It turns out it was tar and nicotine from smokers. Now, I asked whether that rectangle, coincidentally or not, is next to Cancer the crab. No one would say.
Oh, no.
But there it is. And the constellations are all backwards.
That was fascinating.
Backwards. Don't use that sky to navigate by. It turned out that the Columbia University astronomer who gave them the sky chart assumed they would hold it over their head and paint. Instead, they put it down so the constellations all go the wrong way.
Oh, man.
And discovered by an alert commuter a few days after the terminal opened, in fact.
What else?
Lots of
fascinated.
Things. I don't want to give them all away.
Oh, come on.
Underneath Grand Central,
one more.
There is one great room that has some of the old equipment, these giant old converters that converted alternating current into direct current for the trains. Now they're, you know, sleek computers that do the same thing and they just hum. But that is the deepest basement in New York. It's 90 feet below street level, deeper than the World Trade Center, deeper than the gold vaults at the Federal Reserve Bank. And with the Long Island Access coming in, there's going to be an even deeper basement. That is 120 feet, 12 stories below street level.
Wow, that's really remarkable. You said earlier that it's more than a transit hub. It's really a vibrant retail space.
Well, it is. I mean, you say terminal and it sort of conjures up endings. Grand Central is really a place of beginnings. Spiritually, commercially, in terms of transit, in terms of lots of other things. And one of the things people don't realize, again, I discovered it, and in comparison with Penn Station, when Grand Central was built initially, the Times said it's neither grand nor central. Why did they put it in the middle of nowhere all the way uptown on 42nd Street? Well, the Vanderbilts brought Midtown Manhattan to their doorstep by creating this, you know, majesty cathedral of a building that performed a great public function.
Metro North, you indicated earlier, really saved the building in the 1990s, and you described it as enlightened self-interest. Did, in fact, the renovation materially change the economics of the railroad industry or Metro North?
Well, what it changed is making Grand Central much more of a winning proposition financially.
Right, as
the
a
amount
building.
of rent, retail rent now being taken in, absolutely dwarfs what was going on before. Millions and millions of dollars, which are not enough to pay for everything, but help subsidize the cost of running the railroad.
Sure.
There are other tenants too, booksellers, stores.
Apple.
Something like 10,000 people come to Grand Central every day just to eat.
Well, downstairs you've got some
Gorgeous.
great dining.
Great dining. You have the Oyster Bar, which was the original
please,
tenant
yes.
in Grand Central, and you have the food courts, the markets that just sell fabulous stuff.
It is really a destination.
And that's what it's become, and it wasn't before. It was a railroad terminal. And when you look at what it is today, 100 years after it was built, accommodating so many more people than it did 100 years ago, it really is a remarkable feat of engineering and a remarkable feat, as I say, of enlightened public interest by Metro North.
Let's go to this Midtown East rezoning. I mean, we're talking about a 70-block area from 39th to 57th around Grand Central. Your reactions to the plan, certainly generally, but more specifically in terms of Grand Central?
Well, mixed. It's very interesting because it was not all that long ago when the City Planning Commission rezoned the west side
Right.
to make it more appealing to developers because the east side was too congested.
Right.
Then that development took place in West Midtown, now obviously Hudson Yards and that
Right.
area. And now they're saying, well, all those buildings, or many of those buildings on the east side of Manhattan, flanking Park Avenue, Lex Madison, are old. They're not the kind of quality Class A buildings that tenants want to move in. They don't have high enough ceilings to accommodate, computer wiring and
Sure.
ventilation. They don't have big spaces for trading floors or whatever. So the city is trying to encourage more development. The problem with that is to make sure that any development accommodates pedestrians.
Right.
Congestion. One thought is to make Vanderbilt Avenue a pedestrian mall, and also to protect the non-landmarked landmarks like the Roosevelt Hotel, like the Yale Club, like the Graybar
Exactly.
building that might be subject to development.
I mean, and this has got historical parallels when the new terminal was built in the early 1900s, because you had great buildings that were destroyed by that development. Do you lose more than you gain here?
Well, but we've got to remember this is a city that is constantly renewing itself.
Right.
So if you have the proper protections, never enough protections to satisfy everyone.
Sure.
But if you can say these out of 17 potential development sites that are historic, we're going to preserve the top 8 or whatever, some arbitrary number, then I think you can't really stand in the way of progress. And if this is rentable space that will keep the city going as a business center,
Sure.
as a global
Sure.
capital, I don't think we have too much choice.
The economic imperative. But I mean, you mentioned the development on the west side, and then the World Trade Center comes online as office space. Are we playing a zero-sum game with ourselves in the city?
Well, we are if you think of the city as one area competing against the other. But if there is indeed that kind of demand for office space in Midtown,
right.
And people are willing to build it and rent it, and a large part of that demand is in fact created by Grand Central.
Sure.
That is where people
Sure.
come.
Sure.
It is grand and it is central. It has finally lived up to its name.
Ooh, okay. I'm teaching a course at Macaulay Honors College called Shaping the Future of New York City. What lessons are there in Grand Central from the beginning to the current day for urban planners and city officials like Moynihan or the New York Public Library, these other great public spaces that are undergoing massive renovations, and in the case of the library, substantial opposition? Are there lessons there?
I think there are. One lesson is that urban planning is a great tool. When you look at the impact that something like Grand Central or Rockefeller Center had on the middle of Manhattan, I mean, those were visionary urban plans. They defied the street grid, something we tinker with very reluctantly. Central Park, obviously another one. Someone had the vision to say, this is going to be a great thing. It's risky, it's different, but we're going to take a chance because the payoff, not so much financially, but spiritually in terms of what this city is all about, is so much greater. Public-private partnership is another thing. Nobody can afford to do these things on their own anymore, either get the approvals or get the money. So you look at something like Grand Central originally, the Vanderbilts built the building. The government rebuilt the building after, you know, a railroad company went bankrupt. That was arguably a great partnership, and it has worked. So, you know, you have to have visionaries, you have to encourage visionaries, you want to preserve the best things about this city, but you also, to a great extent, can't stand in the way of progress.
And in the case of Moynihan, replacing a truly, truly ugly, ugly facility that's Penn Station, and at least potentially have a grand rail station.
That would be terrific. Would it be great in terms of transportation? I'm not entirely sure. But would it be a great gateway to New York as opposed to what's there now? It would be fabulous.
What do you tell my students in the class about shaping New York? You've been around forever. In terms of development, in terms of planning, are there any Roberts rules?
One rule, don't give up. Ooh. It is so easy to become discouraged, to be disappointed, to say you can't fight City Hall. But if you have a good idea, you build a constituency for it. It takes time, it takes political will, it takes courage, guts. But there are things that have gotten accomplished in the city, some, you know, that we really take for granted, like the third water tunnel. We are finally building at least a slice of the 2nd Avenue subway.
Right.
The number 7 line.
We were
extension.
kids,
yeah,
come on.
Kids. It was 1929.
Well, we more than kids.
Right.
Embryos. Our parents were kids.
Exactly.
Okay.
So things do happen. You just have to keep fighting for them.
Okay. Thanks to Sam Roberts for a great conversation and a truly beautiful book. See you next week here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.